Hello, this is Writers at Work, a podcast for readers and writers about the joys, heartaches, challenges, and satisfaction of the creative writing process. I'm your host, Jim Fusilli. With me on Writers at Work is Matthew Pearl, author of the novel The Award. And I will say up front that if you are a writer or want to be a writer or are curious at all about writers, this is a book for you. More in a moment. Matthew Pearl is the author of many highly regarded and best-selling novels, including the historical fiction works The Dante Club and The Poe Shadow, the latter about the death of Edgar Allan Poe. His The Technologists is an alternative history about the early days of MIT. In 2021, he published his first work of nonfiction, The Taking of Jemima Boone, Colonial Settlers, Tribal Nations, and the Kidnap That Shaped America. His journalism has appeared in the New York Times, the Boston Globe, and Slate. Which brings us to the award. The New Yorker said it revels in its wickedness, and Tom Perrotta called it addictive and propulsive in comparing it to a Patricia Highsmith thriller. Without giving too much away, in the award, struggling novelist David Trent moves into a building in Cambridge, Massachusetts. On the floor below lives Silas Hale, a very famous author who, despite his acclaim, is disdainful to many, David perhaps most of all. But then David wins a major award for his novel. Or does he? And chaos ensues. Who knew writing was such a fraught and deadly occupation? I found the award to be a lot of fun, its characters all too familiar, yet surprising in their actions. Thus, allow me to say, Matthew Pearl, welcome to Writers at Work.
Thanks so much for having me, Jim.
Matthew, let me contextualize this question for our listeners who may not be as familiar with your body of work as they should be. Your early novels revealed a passion for research, and you created these wonderful alternative histories that you explored in your fiction. And then in 2021, you published your first nonfiction book. As your reader, I felt that the award was a departure. I had a sense that you just let it rip. Is that true?
It's really true, actually. It's kind of right on target. I I actually sort of burnt out on fiction, which which led to that what you mentioned, that first nonfiction book, and I've done now two nonfiction books and have another one that I'm working on. But I really kind of fell off a cliff with my fiction, and the award, my new novel, really was a surprising way back into it.
When did you first begin thinking about doing what became the award?
So I have a document, probably like a lot of writers, that is just a scramble of ideas. And it's literally just called Ideas, the document. And some years ago, I just wrote the idea of just a story about neighbors. I've had so many, particularly when I lived in the Boston area and Cambridge, we had so many strange and sometimes um, exhausting, sometimes dangerous neighbor situations, crazy, funny, whatever adjectives you want to throw in there. That I just jotted it down as an idea that you'd have a story about neighbors, but not really thinking I would do anything with it because it was not the kind of story I tend to do. And then years later, it came back to me once I had some distance. We had moved away from the Boston area, which I should say right up front that there's so many things I love about that area. There's also things just like anywhere that, can drive you crazy. But when we moved away and I had some distance from it, I started to think more about that and combine it with my own experience as a writer, and sort of my journey as a writer, getting to know other writers. And I was in the pool one day. I actually remember, rarely would I remember having an actual moment of an idea for a specific story, but we live in South Florida now, where I grew up, and I was in the pool, and my wife was in the pool, and I just told her this idea, which ultimately was the award.
Amazing. I love your author's note. Some of this happened. Would it be unfair to ask which parts happened?
I had an editor once who said if you could write something as nonfiction, write it as nonfiction, which it really stuck with me. I probably have forgotten many things that each of my wonderful editors has said, but that always stuck with me. Yeah, so if I could have written probably the nonfiction version of all my encounters with and dynamics with other writers, maybe I would have, but
Okay,
I can't, right?
I
Because
get you.
it's not necessarily fair to throw other people into your stories that way. So no, well, so part of that note, the some of this happened. A little bit of it is just tongue in cheek in the sense that all fiction comes in one way or the other, even if you're writing about, 1850, a story set in 1850, it's coming from your life also. So
Yes.
some of that note is just kind of playing with how we think of fiction. But that said, a very large percentage of things in the story, which is about this young writer protagonist who's on his journey through the literary landscape, really did happen, or were things I observed about the writing world, about writers. I was always just, I think I was especially curious about other writers and the writing world in part because my writing journey started almost by accident. I kind of stumbled into it. And so I think I was always paying very close attention, asking lots of questions, even when I would do more book tours, and I don't do that much of that anymore. And book tours themselves have changed. That's probably a whole other conversation. But you used to have they call them author escorts who would pick you up if you were doing right. They would pick you up at the airport. They would bring you to bookstores. If they'd bring you to a hotel if you were doing kind of a structured book tour. And I would always, plop myself right in the front passenger seat and just say, okay, who were who are your favorite writers that you've driven around? What are the crazy experiences you have? And it's funny because many of the author escorts told me about the same writer, obviously can't name names, and said he would get in the back seat of the car. He would say, "Do not look at me. Do not make eye contact with me, and do not speak to me unless I speak to you." So that's an example of something I actually extracted part of that and put it into one of the characters in the award. But again, it's just this real curiosity I always had because for myself, I think the question while I've been a writer for all these years was what does it mean to be a writer? I think I'm always wrestling with that question.
Yeah, yeah. As the story unfolds, you describe many situations that'll be familiar to most aspiring novelists. David is thinking that a mentorship will unlock some kind of golden door for him. He has rules for finding the right table to work at in a coffee shop.
Mhm.
He agonizes over a single sentence. And then there's a comment by a friend who ghostwrites memoirs for business executives and athletes. His friend says, I don't get why you're sweating it. You write fiction. All you do is make things up.
Mhm.
I mean, is this reflective of your experiences?
Well, that little banter is actually based on a kind of conversation I'd have over those coffee shop tables with a friend of mine who's a nonfiction writer, not a ghostwriter, actually. And that character of the ghostwriter is not based on my friend Kevin, who's a very accomplished nonfiction writer. He wrote a book about the censorship of James Joyce's Ulysses called The Most Dangerous Book,
Oh,
and then a book about about how crime and punishment was came to life, which is called The Sinner and the Saint. Anyway, but Kevin and I would have these discussions. This was before I was writing nonfiction, or at least not writing much of it, about what was harder, fiction or nonfiction. So it sort of represents just the kind of kind of blowing off steam when you're trying to get your writing done, and the grass is always greener. I think that's part of it, right? When you're writing, at least I find, you always look at another book that comes out and say, wow, that must have been fun to write. Why aren't I writing that kind of thing? Or you're writing fiction and you're looking at nonfiction or vice versa.
You alluded to something a minute or two ago. It seems to me that David really doesn't know why he wants to be a writer. And his fiance says that writing makes him miserable, so maybe he should leave it to miserable people.
Hmm.
She asks, is it better to be happy or to be a writer?
Yeah.
So it's easy to say that she doesn't understand why we write, but David doesn't seem to understand it either. He says, you have him saying, and I love this quote, maybe I'm not a writer because I write, but someone who writes to become a writer.
Yeah.
And I love that. Where do you fall on that spectrum?
Oh, I'm always wrestling with myself. Again, I think part of this is because I didn't. Some people dream of being a writer from the time they're 10, right? Or
Right,
and I didn't have that. And part of that, and I actually incorporate this into David's life. Plenty of David is drawn from me, and parts of him are not. But I had never met a writer. I actually notice a difference, Jim, when I see my own kids in school now. I have three kids. They read plenty of things that um, they are assigned plenty of reading and books that are by people who are alive, right? I,
right,
I don't have that memory. My memory is every single thing I read in school, and I ended up being a pretty serious student and a pretty serious reader, were from quite a long time ago. So I was not ever really even imagining these folks as that I was reading as living people. And I had never met a writer. And because I grew up in Florida, we had astronauts come speak to the school pretty regularly because of the space program. And I incorporate this, I think, into part of David's history too, which is that I always joke, except it's not a joke. It's true that I met many astronauts before I ever met a writer, and it would have felt much more realistic to me, even if it wasn't for myself, to go into space than to write a book, right? Because I was
right.
seeing people who were doing that, actual human beings, right? So for me, being a reader for so long was very detached from what it meant to be a writer. And even in college, I remember, because I was an English major, um, I remember seeing people who were applying or doing creative writing in college, and I couldn't fathom it. Partially because you had to write in order to be accepted, at least at this particular program, in order to even try creative writing. That idea that you'd have to write fiction before you ever get taught how to write fiction was totally terrifying to me. I never did it. I never tried it, right? But it was, to me, literature was something from a long time ago. So I think that's part of why my early books, when I did start writing fiction, and you were kind enough to mention them, were sort of trying to bring to life writers from the past,
Hmm.
from the 19th century, because those were who I thought of as writers, but I didn't necessarily think of them as people. In fact, the academia, it's kind of frowned upon to think of writers or to try to understand writers by trying to understand them as people, right? That's something that my memory of kind of the history of English academia or English literature academia in the 1920s, the 1930s, if you were in academia, you would be trying to understand Moby Dick by learning about Herman Melville and what his life was like. And then there was a real backlash to that by the 50s and 60s, where you were never supposed to think of writers as people. You were supposed to, right? It was the new criticism. It was the close reading. It was looking at text as text, all this kind of thing. So yeah, I think all of that sort of got into my system. And so for me, I have always, since I started writing and continue to really struggle with, am I a writer? Am I good enough to be a writer? Would this book that I'm working on be better if this other writer was writing it? I'm sure it would be. Those kinds of struggles. And that all sort of factors into David's journey, and I think really in this case helped me bring the book to life. It was really cathartic, and I think that's why I was able to jump back into fiction with it.
I think though your body of work suggests that you are, and I know many writers like this who say, I cannot not write. I must always write.
Yeah.
And one thing I found interesting about the award is I didn't come across any character who felt that way, who was compelled to write regardless of success or failure, acclaim or being ignored, that they just had to do it because that they had no choice.
Yeah, it's an interesting observation. I don't know that I thought about it through that lens. I think what I really got energized by was to realize this, and it sort of relates to your point, this sort of schism between the writers who struggle with their identity and what we might call in other contexts sort of imposter syndrome, right? Am I
Right,
that's really where I belong? And then those writers who to me have always seemed like aliens from outer space, who know that they're born to write, they're better than everyone else. So that would be, for example, the Silas Hale, the neighbor of David,
right.
David is initially sort of dreaming to be his mentor. Um, and I've known so many of both categories and of writers, and I think that's what whether it's somebody who feels they have to write, they can't not write, that's kind of a sort of an ideal version of a writer, and maybe not so much what you meet sort of on the ground, or at least or at least not who I've encountered as much in terms of a type
Ah,
out there in the writing world. I never had a mentor, so part of the story is sort of dramatizing that search. I mean, I've started in historical fiction, so there were writers I admired very much, like Caleb Carr,
right,
who has passed away, but was sort of one of the kind of leading voices of historical fiction of a certain type, like The Alienist was his big breakthrough. And I got to meet Caleb Carr, and he's very quiet. He was very reserved, but really kind, really generous. Another person I admired so much was Umberto Eco with Name of the Rose, and I got to meet
right.
him, and he was not kind or generous or quiet. He was sort of on the other end of the spectrum. Rest in peace, Professor Eco. But that also kind of always stuck with me. These two people who maybe I could have envisioned being a mentor if I had had any kind of chance for either of those to be, which I didn't in either case. It did not live near either of them or anything, but that I crossed paths with both and had this very different energy from them.
Yeah. I think one of the strange things about publishing, as opposed to other art forms, I mean, I think about when you're in a band. You start out in a crappy little band in your neighborhood, and then maybe you join a better band in another part of the city, and you systematically build up. And along the way, you meet better musicians, people who know how to get good sound, how people who know how to run a recording studio. And by the time you're ready to present your album to the industry, you've had all this support. Meanwhile, in publishing, you're expected to turn up with the final product.
Mm,
And having, as you described, and it was the same for me, having had no help,
yeah.
and and I think that that goes to the compulsion, because it is so difficult, um, that if you could do something else, you might. Anyway, you're talking about whether you're a writer or not. Um, of course you are. I love the first sentence of your novel. Uh, if he could have known all the lives that would be wrecked, David still would have had agreed to all that was to come. Now, in 23 words, you have foreshadowed story and character. And I don't think it's luck that causes that kind of writing. You know, I mean, did that line come to you fully formed? Did you have it in your notebook? Did you at least have an idea how you wanted to start the book?
Yeah, that's a great question. I appreciate so much the the kind description of that opening. And I've been really pleased to hear from a couple different people that other writers that they've already used that line in lectures or talks about how to start a book, even though the book came out pretty recently. They've already used that sort of out in the world as an example. Um, I It's funny. I remember so much about my process for this book, and I don't remember when I put in that line. I know it wasn't there right away. The draft stayed pretty stable. I always began the draft in the same way in terms of our first scene where we meet David and
Yeah.
his then girlfriend Bonnie looking at the sort of unit at the top of a three-story Victorian house that they're eventually going to move into. And I think later on I went back and I added that. I know that I added that line later on. But the flow of the novel in general came really naturally in this case, which it doesn't always. It doesn't have to. It doesn't mean that there's something wrong with something you're working on if it doesn't, right? But part of what I did differently with this book, Jim, is that it's the first book I worked on since my first novel, which nobody knew. Well, who would have known that I was working on it? There was nobody to tell that I was working on it. But it's the first time since then that I didn't tell anybody that I was working on this. So normally I
Oh,
would run it by other than my wife in the pool when I first thought of it. But and I use that visual of being in the pool because I think I needed to be so far away from the settings and the story of the novel. Um, but yeah, I didn't tell, and I didn't sort of run it by my agent or the editor that I've been working with, who fortunately I got a chance to continue to work with on this. It really was just my project for fun, and I work on so many things that I end up not finishing or get stuck on or whatever. But in this case, I just kept going, and I think it sort of liberated me in all kinds of ways.
yeah. Let's talk about Silas Hale, the very famous author, and you capitalize each letter in that name there. Despite his Pulitzer and wide acclaim, he's a miserable SOB, isn't he?
Yeah, definitely.
Would you handle him differently than David did?
Um, well, let's say that I've run into and known some Silas Hales, and no, I probably would shrink from them, or I have kind of felt myself shrink in the presence of that kind of territorial belligerence, maybe we'd call it, right?
Yes.
Of a writer who already has his or her sort of footprint and yet is very threatened or very hostile towards sort of other people who want to explore being a writer, who are writers and haven't had don't have as much of a kind of established name or presence as that writer. So no, I think part of the appeal of writing this was that David, who also is very rattled by Silas in the way that I would be, but David ends up kind of crossing lines that I I myself wouldn't
Right,
be able
right.
to cross.
Well, I love what you do because it has two effects. One is that a couple of times you show us a sentence that Silas has written, and it's not great,
Yeah.
you know. So he's a gas bag. Um, but also you kind of reinforce the idea that being a successful writer often doesn't have anything to do with the quality of writing.
That's how I feel, definitely. I think there's all kinds of other layers in how we perceive books. Maybe I'm even extra sensitive, not to say I'm right about that, because of how much work I've done on 19th century literature, first as a student and somewhat as an unofficial academic. I didn't go into academia, but I've done various sort of quasi-academic things with 19th century literature, teaching it and editing volumes, that kind of thing. But it's interesting because you see what books are revered from 150 years ago, whenever it was, and then which ones end up, for whatever it's worth, sort of staying in the conversation so many years later. Of course, you could argue that that process isn't necessarily fair or organic either. But you could think about, for example, with the 19th century, a number of writers who were either unknown or underknown or underappreciated. Walt Whitman, Edgar Allan Poe, Emily Dickinson, who kind of overtake the writers who were much more visible, right?
Right.
Longfellow, for example, and his circle, who I've written about, who were celebrities, who they were household names, who we don't read very much anymore. So again, that's kind of, but I do think we're often kind of told what to read, or told what's brilliant. Um, Not just in books, maybe in other media too. I think this happens with movies too, where we're kind of it's kind of things are pre-stamped as brilliant and amazing.
Yes.
Sometimes I take a look at something that is supposed to be that, and I just can't figure it out. Maybe it says more about me than that, but I do think there's so many more layers of how we influence each other, how the industry influences us, how the writers themselves and their sort of personas, if that's a fair word, can influence. I think someone like Silas Hale, and a few interviewers have asked me if I know John Irving and if that's who he's based on. I don't. I've never met him. I've read him, but I've actually never seen an interview with him, so I have no idea. But more than one person brought that up, so maybe maybe there's some similarities there. Right? But I think part of the persona of someone like Silas Hale is that kind of larger than life hostility. Actually, maybe that makes us more reverent and more believing that that person is a genius. Maybe there's part of our brain that's programmed to interpret that, right, as, oh, that's someone I have to kind of listen to, or I have to follow, or who must be really brilliant, must be a genius because of that sort of force of nature that seems around to
Yeah.
surround.
He has some philosophies that are just abhorrent, and you convey them really well. I mean, these are a couple of things that he says. Silas Hale says, "We feed our soul into our writing, and we're owed all the world can give us in return."
Yeah.
And then with David, he says, to David, he says, "Everything that makes you happy outside your writing life will wither and deteriorate." Um, this is I don't understand someone like that, even though he is completely believable and very real. I'm just talking about on a human level. I don't know how
Totally.
anybody could be that way.
Yeah, I agree with you, and I think that's part of the exploration here, um, because I think for myself in life with other writers or just with other people, I'm very non-confrontational. So I will just kind of disappear from a situation in which somebody is trying to impose this kind of hostility toward me, and I think it happens more often with neighbors. And by the way, when I lived in Cambridge, which was for many years, there were always writers all around me as neighbors also. So that's where that intersection came from, of thinking about how we interact with our neighbors and how writers interact with other writers. Is there was never a moment in Cambridge where I didn't have often very prominent writers who were my neighbors, right? But in real life, I just kind of slink away. I really struggle with confrontation, probably for a bunch of reasons, maybe having to do with childhood. I don't know.
Yeah. No, I
Right.
mean, the reaction to bullies is,
Yeah.
I mean, I think you have to discipline yourself for that.
I think you're right. And so I think, so for me, I think I would just always avoid these situations and in fact avoid even talking about them because they were really scarring for me. So that's part of when I say that award was cathartic to write. I got to incorporate these sorts of people that I really did have to deal with both in the writing world and just sort of in everyday life and neighbors. And I got to sort of remix that narrative. Um, and that allowed me to actually kind of recapture the a way to tell stories about it as opposed to, which is what I do because I'm a writer, as opposed to avoiding it, which is what I do as a person.
You know, one character says to David, writers deserve every bit of adulation and reverence we can spare. But that Hale says of, I mean, Hale's grumpiness and curmudgeonliness extends to readers as well.
Oh yeah.
He says you think they are your friends, but they're not. You'll realize they are impossible to please. And another point, he says everybody wants to see you choke. And I haven't had that experience. Have you?
I haven't, but I have had the experience of seeing the contempt that many writers, many very successful writers, have for their own readers. So that's where that comes from. It's like that it really has fascinated me to observe that. Some writers really wear masks and they wear them well. And when you're behind the scenes, that look, you interview a lot of writers and presumably they are always on their best behavior for you. And if they do wear a mask, then it's on, right? Sometimes you're at literary festivals or conferences, and maybe you've had this experience too, but you see the mask drop, even if it's
Yes,
just a bit. And I think that's where that comes from. Again, if anything, I'm very intimidated by readers, my readers, any readers. It's, that relationship is interesting to me. It's, again, as a writer that comes from if we sort of have a range of who we are as writers, I'm definitely on the side, which there are plenty of writers who are, that part of why we start writing is that we tend to be more introverted, more introspective. We're not necessarily the ones to sort of jump up and down and promote ourselves and yet as writers, we're asking, we're expecting, we're begging sometimes that people pick up hundreds of pages that we've written. And
correct.
there's an arrogance about that. And
Yes,
in some ways, on the other end of that spectrum of writers is a much more natural fit, which is the Silas Hale or whoever you want to fill in the blank who actually exists in real life. Who know you should be, not only should you be reading my 400 pages that I wrote for the next month of your life or week of your life or whatever, however long it takes, but I hope you can understand it because I'm so superior to you. So there's that. Oh, that's almost a more natural fit to be is to be expecting people to read your work. It's a tough balance for someone who can feel insecure about themselves, which so many writers, myself included, do.
yeah, I think that's one of the reasons why um, we say, those of us who say it, I cannot not write, because that gives us license to make that demand.
Mm, that's a good point. Yeah.
Um, when I see that mask slip, and I know exactly what you're talking about. When I see that mask slip, I can never forget it. That moment just etches into my brain that here's somebody I admired, and they are now being surrounded by, or even just on a one-on-one with someone who also admires them, and they stop being that person, and they're
Exactly.
and it's just I can't forget it. On the other hand, and I'm sure you've had this experience also. I'm a little bit too old to have heroes, but I have some people I really admire, and I've gotten to know them, and I would call them friends, and yet that admiration has never disappeared. I could be sitting there having dinner with them for the 35th time and say to myself, oh my God, I'm having dinner with X.
Yeah, and I think that probably says a lot about that person, about X, because sometimes when we get to know someone, it can interfere with that, right? With that admiration. Not necessarily the fault of the person. You're getting to know them with all of their faults, like we all have, right?
Right, right.
But yeah, I think there's it definitely says something, and the irony of me having written this novel, sort of having burnt out from fiction, is that it really, once I wrote it and sort of started getting it out there, I've heard from so many writers just who really clicked with it and saw themselves, their own experiences in it, and have been incredibly generous with supporting the book. So the sort of punchline for me is that it kind of brought me close to a number of writers who I didn't really know,
Oh, great.
or closer, and kind of showed that generosity and the positivity of. So, for example, Dean Koontz picked up the novel and just not only wrote me this email that I couldn't believe at how well he sort of responded to the award, but he, for the first time that he's ever done this, he used his email newsletter, which he uses for his readers to tell them about his new books. He devoted a newsletter to telling them about my book, which is the only time he's ever done that about another writer's book.
Wow. Wow.
So that's just one example, but really sort of the opposite of kind of what I was exploring and sort of purging from my own experiences in the story itself.
Yeah, I have to say I'm not surprised by that, Matthew, because I think, and if I think what is text and what is subtext in your book changes if you're a reader or you're a writer. I want to turn this book over to my wife and get her reaction to it. She's not a writer, but she is a devout reader. She reads relentlessly. Um, I really appreciate how you portray writers here. And I just wonder if a general interest reader cares about that. Meanwhile, the book is highly entertaining anyway, you know? So, yeah. Anyway, this is a bit of a tangent, but you just made me think about it. You do a lot of journalism, um, and we have to have a distance from our subjects when we do our journalism. When we do our fiction, we have to have an intimacy with our subjects. I wonder how that can serve us when we are interfacing with the world at large. Do we know how to shift into putting that distance?
That's a great way.
I don't know.
Yeah, it's a great way
And
to look at it.
the reason I ask is because David Trent is such a liar. And he shifts when he starts spinning a lie, he's fully committed to it.
Right.
He just doesn't say something in passing. He then goes with it for the rest of the conversation.
And that's exactly sort of the way David becomes someone who could cross lines that most of us, myself included, couldn't. Sometimes in a way that we root for, I think, in spite of ourselves. And to give you a quick example, this doesn't spoil anything because it's early in the novel. We find out that part of David's history is that a very well-respected literary novelist promised him that she would write a recommendation for him to apply to MFA programs, right? And then she just ghosts him. He emails her, he reminds her, and she just disappears, right? And never writes that recommendation. So most of us would just drop it there, right? I dropped it there because that actually happened to me, not for applying to an MFA program, which I never did, but I was applying to a fellowship, a writing fellowship. And a novelist who had that fellowship volunteered, oh, I'll write your recommendation. Right. So the same thing happened to me, and then she
Oh,
vanished in thin air. And me being me, my brain would just, okay, I must have said the wrong thing. Oh, okay, my email must have been worded in a way that somehow insulted her and she never wants to see me again or speak to me, right? Or she read something else I wrote and didn't like. I still, by the way, Jim, I still don't know why she
You still
disappeared.
don't know? Yeah.
Probably no reason at all, right? But like probably she got busy with her kids or something, which,
Right.
like, but for David, what he does is he gets so fixated on the injustice of it in the story that he forges a recommendation from Melody Bradshaw, the character who ghosts him, and for no reason. He didn't even need that recommendation. He had enough other recommendations. But for him, it's a question of justice, right? So he crosses that line and he writes it in her name. So yeah, I think what there's a certain element of when we read a character like that. You know what I called it for myself, Jim, just as like an internal category of when I started writing this novel. I wrote a few things at the top of my document, which I still have, my working document, and one of them was cringe suspense. So that was the category that I was sort of thinking. It doesn't sort of flow off the tongue, so I don't think that could ever be a real category. But cringe suspense, meaning where we don't want David to forge that. We know it's going to cause trouble, but also we're kind of rooting for him to get away with it because he's right. She should have written him that recommendation. So you're sort of cringing while you're in suspense about what is going to happen through that action.
So earlier you alluded to what you're working on now. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. Well, I'm a little bit at a crossroads. I'm definitely doing another narrative nonfiction book. So you mentioned that I had kind of started toggling between fiction and nonfiction, and I specifically do narrative nonfiction, right? Which is this sort of um, category, just meaning that you're writing the nonfiction as a story, right? So it's not academic writing, it's not essay, it's not opinion. It should read more or less as if you're reading a novel, right? So I'm writing another one. I wrote one. Published my last narrative nonfiction book was called Save Our Souls, which is about a family in the late 19th century who got stranded on an island together. So sort of a real life Swiss Family Robinson, except that there was someone else already stranded on the island who turns out to be a murderer
Oh
who
Lord.
was marooned on the island because he murdered the captain of his ship. So it was this sort of the great kind of how is that possibly true story. And I'm working on another maritime nonfiction story. So another story that kind of I ran across while I was working on Save Our Souls, right? Because that often happens. This. You're working on one project and you kind of stumble on something else that's sort of slightly related or in the same sphere.
Yeah.
So I'm working on that, and then I'm trying to think, whether there's well, I'm playing around with a couple different fiction projects, and so I definitely have that spark back for working on fiction, although I'm not sure when or if I'll have another one out there anytime soon.
So do you enjoy the writer's life?
Um, I enjoy, well, I guess I go back and forth. I sometimes it can feel like you're setting yourself up to be tormented by it, right?
Right.
And I really enjoy the stage of coming up with new ideas and kind of challenging yourself, like, oh, is this something I could write? And how would I do it? And what, so that's really the two stages I like best, strangely, are the idea stage and then the revision stage. The actual kind of first drafts of working on something feels pretty stressful to me still.
My guest on this episode of Writers at Work is Matthew Pearl, best-selling author whose latest is the award. I encourage you, especially if you're a writer, aspiring writer, love a writer, admire writers, and so on, to rush out, grab it, and read it. Matthew, thank you so much for joining us on Writers at Work.
Thank you, Jim.
Writers at Work is a production of Bliss Publications. Erin Mitchell is our producer. Music is by Joni Mitchell, performed by Keith Jarrett. For more, see writersatworkpodcast.com. I'm your host, Jim Fusilli. Until next time, happy reading.